Number 8. Justinian I. In 541 A.D., Constantinople smelled like death. The plague had come in through the port, carried on grain ships from Egypt, invisible, unstoppable. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew how to stop it. Within weeks, people were dropping in the streets mid-stride. The swellings came first, black, hard lumps bursting through the skin at the groin and armpits. Then the fever. Then the hallucinations. Some people threw themselves into the sea just to escape the heat coming from inside their own bodies. At its peak, the city was losing 10,000 people a day, not a week, a day. Gravediggers ran out of ground. Priests ran out of prayers. Soldiers started opening the towers of the city walls, throwing bodies inside and sealing them shut. Procopius, who was there and saw it with his own eyes, wrote that the smell drifted over the whole city for months. At some point, the living just stopped noticing it. While all of this was happening, Justinian was issuing paperwork, not medical orders, not food distribution, tax decrees. Specifically, a law that made surviving neighbors responsible for paying the taxes of their dead. Your entire street dies in a week. You survive. Congratulations. Now pay their bills. This wasn't a rushed decision made in panic. It was written up, reviewed, and entered permanently into Byzantine law, the same legal code Justinian spent his whole reign bragging about as his greatest gift to civilization. The system worked like this. People with money and influence who died during the worst months left behind estates that had to pass through imperial courts, Justinian's courts. Political rivals who survived the plague but lost half their allies and support networks found themselves suddenly too weak to push back against anything. Provinces that were so hollowed out by disease that they tried to revolt anyway got the army sent in. The plague had already done most of the work. The soldiers just cleaned up what was left. Whole political factions that had been limiting imperial power for years simply stopped existing. Estates changed hands. Regions that had always maintained some independence got absorbed, not through war, through paperwork and timing and a legal apparatus that never once stopped functioning while the city was stacking its dead inside its own walls. Justinian ruled until 565 A.D. and died at 83 in his palace, surrounded by the legacy he built. So here's the thing. Was he a ruler who took advantage of a catastrophe, or was the catastrophe the reason he became the ruler history remembers? And does that difference actually matter? Number 7. Commodus. Rome in 189 A.D. didn't look like a city that was winning. The Antonine Plague had been grinding through the empire for almost 20 years by then, coming in waves, killing somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman world. In the city itself, people were dying at a rate of 2,000 a day during the worst periods. The bodies piled up faster than the carts could move them. Whole neighborhoods went quiet. Families locked their doors and waited to see who would still be alive in the morning. The disease hit the lungs hard. Fever, pustules covering the skin, blood in the cough. Galen, the most famous physician in the Roman world, watched it spread through the city and wrote down everything he saw. He also quietly left Rome at the height of it, which tells you something about how bad it actually was. Commodus had been emperor for about 9 years when the plague peaked again in 189. He was 27 years old, physically enormous, and almost completely uninterested in governing. What he was interested in was the arena. He fought as a gladiator, not symbolically, not privately, but publicly, hundreds of times, dressed as Hercules, demanding the crowd treat him like a god. He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He was, by almost every account, left behind by people who knew him, a man who had confused being emperor with being worshipped. While the city was coughing itself to death, Commodus and his inner circle started moving against wealthy senators. The accusation was always some version of the same thing: secret conspiracies, hidden sins, divine punishment brought down upon Rome because of their corruption. Cassius Dio, who documented the executions in detail, described a pattern that was almost mechanical. An accusation would appear. The accused would be arrested. They would be executed before anyone could investigate properly. Their estates, land, money, property, would be confiscated. Those estates funded Commodus's gladiatorial obsessions directly. The plague, meanwhile, was producing hundreds of deaths a day, which meant that a few extra bodies showing up in the official count required no explanation and generated no questions. The math was simple. The cover was already there. Commodus was strangled in his bath on the last day of 192 AD, killed by his own inner circle after they discovered he had put their names on the next execution list. He ended up on a list himself, just not the one he was writing. Here's what's hard to answer, though. How many of those senators were actually guilty of something, and how many just had nice houses? And honestly, would it have made any difference? Number 6. Mursili II. The Hittite kingdom in the 1320s BC was sick in a way that had no precedent. A plague had been moving through the population for years. Some historians think it came in with Egyptian prisoners of war, captured during military campaigns to the south, carried back into Hittite territory, along with everything else the army brought home. Nobody knew where it came from at the time. Nobody knew how to stop it. What they knew was that people were dying, and that the dying wouldn't stop. It had already killed Mursili's father, Suppiluliuma I, one of the most powerful Hittite kings in history. Then it killed his older brother, who had taken the throne after him. 2 kings dead in quick succession, the population shrinking, the army weakened, the crops failing because there weren't enough people left to work the fields. The Hittite world had been one of the dominant powers in the ancient Near East for generations. Now, it felt like it was being hollowed out from the inside, and nobody in the temples or the palace had a convincing explanation for why the gods had decided to do this to them. Mursili took the throne in the middle of all of this, and immediately understood something that would define his entire reign. In a world terrified of divine punishment, controlling the explanation for the punishment is the same as controlling the punishment itself. He didn't look for medical solutions. He looked for someone to blame. What he found, or decided he found, was his stepmother. Queen Tawananna had been a powerful figure in the Hittite court for years. She held major religious authority, commanded significant loyalty among the priesthood, and had been a political force long before Mursili was in any position to challenge her. In his famous plague prayers, which survive and can still be read today, Mursili declared publicly that the gods had sent the disease as punishment for her sins. She had angered the divine order. The plague was the proof. The solution, therefore, was obvious. He stripped her of every religious title she held. He exiled her from the court. Then, he systematically removed every person in her political network: priests, officials, advisors, anyone whose loyalty ran to her rather than to him. The population, watching people die around them with no explanation, was in exactly the right psychological state to believe that someone had caused this, and that removing that someone would make it stop. Mursili gave them a face to put on the plague, his stepmother's face. The purge that followed didn't look like a power grab. It looked like a religious solution to a religious problem. The plague did not stop after Tawananna was removed. It continued for years. So here's the question. Did Mursili genuinely believe his stepmother had brought divine punishment down on his kingdom? Or did he already know exactly what he was doing from the beginning? And is there actually a difference between those two things when the result is identical? Number 5. Emperor Shomu, Japan between 735 and 737 AD, lost somewhere around 1/3 of its entire population. 1/3. Smallpox came in through the southern islands, moved through Kyushu, and then spread into the main population centers with nothing to slow it down. Japanese chronicles describe villages going completely silent, not metaphorically, but literally, everyone dead or fled. The disease hit fast, and it hit everywhere at once. Fever, the characteristic pustules covering the skin, blindness in survivors who made it through. Entire administrative districts stopped functioning because there was nobody left to run them. Farming communities collapsed because there weren't enough healthy people to bring in harvests. Families were wiping out across entire bloodlines in a matter of weeks. It is one of the most thoroughly documented demographic catastrophes in ancient Asian history, and the numbers in the records are so extreme that historians spent a long time assuming they must be exaggerated. They weren't. Emperor Shomu looked at all of this and decided the problem was spiritual. Japan had failed Buddha. The epidemic was punishment for insufficient devotion, inadequate temples, not enough prayer directed at the right places. The solution, therefore, was construction. Shomu issued imperial decrees ordering the building of massive Buddhist temple complexes across every province in the country, all of it anchored by the construction of the Great Buddha statue at Nara, a colossal bronze figure that remains one of the largest bronze statues ever built. It was an enormously expensive undertaking. The workforce came from the population that was already sick, already starving, already hollowed out by 2 years of dying. Peasants who had survived the smallpox were conscripted into forced labor on construction sites. They died there, not from battle, not from punishment, but from exhaustion and disease and the simple physical reality of doing brutal work while malnourished and not yet recovered from an epidemic. The building program did not pause for this. The statues kept going up. Whether Shomu genuinely believed that bronze and prayer would fix what smallpox had started, or whether he understood on some level that catastrophe creates the perfect conditions for extracting labor from people too broken to refuse, historians still argue about it. The chronicles present him as a devoted Buddhist acting in sincere faith. The outcomes suggest something more complicated. Shomu abdicated in 749 and became a Buddhist monk. He died in 756, remembered in Japanese history primarily as the emperor who built the Great Buddha. The people who built it with him aren't remembered at all. So here's the question. Does it matter whether Shomu believed what he was doing was right, if what he was doing killed people either way? Number 4. Elagabalus. Rome, in the early 3rd century AD, was already living with plague as a background condition. The Antonine plague had never fully disappeared. It kept returning in waves, hitting different provinces at different times, wearing down the population in a slow, grinding way that had become almost normalized. People died. People kept dying. The medical understanding of why was essentially non-existent, which meant the explanations were religious by default. The gods were angry. Someone had offended the divine order. The suffering had a cause, and that cause was spiritual, and the solution was therefore spiritual too. For most Romans, this was genuinely believed, not cynically performed. The empire had been built on a specific relationship with a specific set of gods, and when things went catastrophically wrong, the instinct was to look at what had changed in that relationship. That instinct turned out to be extremely useful for a teenage emperor who wanted to change everything. Elagabalus became emperor in 218 AD at around 14 years old, installed by the army after a political power struggle that had nothing to do with his own abilities. He came from Syria. He was a priest of the sun god Elagabal, and he arrived in Rome with a plan to replace the entire Roman religious system with his own. Not gradually, immediately. He brought the sacred black stone of his Syrian cult to Rome, placed it above Jupiter in the divine hierarchy, and began systematically dismantling the traditional priestly institutions that had structured Roman religious life for centuries. The priests of the old cults were removed from their positions. Their temple treasuries were confiscated and redirected. Their authority was transferred to Elagabalus's Syrian religious network, and the justification he used, publicly and repeatedly, was the plague. Rome was still suffering because Rome was still worshipping the wrong gods. The epidemic was the proof. The old priesthood had failed the city. Their continued presence was the reason people kept dying. It was a clean argument in a terrified city, hard to argue against when the alternative explanation was just bad luck. The traditional religious establishment lost its wealth, its political influence, and its institutional power base in the space of a few years, and every step of that process came wrapped in the language of spiritual correction rather than political takeover. It didn't last. The Praetorian Guard, exhausted by 4 years of religious chaos and increasingly erratic imperial behavior, assassinated Elagabalus and his mother in 222 AD. They threw their bodies into the Tiber. He was 18 years old. A teenager dismantled centuries of Roman religious infrastructure in 4 years, using a plague as his argument. So the question is, was he a true believer who genuinely thought he was saving Rome? Or did someone older and smarter put him up to it and hand him the script? Number 3. King Cleomenes III. Sparta, in the 3rd century BC, was being eaten alive by something it couldn't fight. An epidemic had moved through the city during a period already stretched thin by political tension and economic collapse. People were dying in neighborhoods that had been declining for generations anyway. The population had been shrinking for decades. The famous Spartan military machine was running out of men to feed into it, and now disease was accelerating everything. The sick had no real treatment. Quarantine zones appeared in parts of the city. Whole households went quiet. For ordinary Spartans, it was just more loss layered on top of losses they were already carrying. For Cleomenes III, the king who had been trying to push through radical land reform against fierce resistance from the wealthy elite, it was something else entirely. Cleomenes had a specific problem. The ephors, 5 magistrates whose constitutional job was to limit royal power, had been blocking his redistribution agenda for years. These were wealthy, landed men with every reason to stop a king who wanted to cancel debts and break up large estates. They had the legal authority to do it, and they were using it. Then the epidemic gave Cleomenes a tool. Wealthy ephors who opposed him most loudly ended up in quarantine zones and were denied assistance while the disease ran its course. Whether he ordered this directly or simply made sure nobody intervened is the part the historical record stays quiet about. Either way, the men blocking him died. Their estates moved into redistribution. His reform program, stalled for years, suddenly had no one left to stop it. He went further. He declared publicly that the epidemic was divine punishment for the corruption of the old regime. The plague wasn't random. It was judgment. The people dying had brought it on everyone. In a city already frightened and desperate for an explanation, that message landed exactly as he needed it to. Cleomenes pushed through debt cancellation, land redistribution, and expanded citizenship, everything he had promised. Then he was defeated by Macedon, fled to Egypt, and died in captivity trying to start a rebellion that never got off the ground. He got his revolution. The people who paid for it didn't get to see what happened next. Was he a reformer who used brutal methods to help the poor majority? Or was the reform just a story he told while doing what he was always going to do anyway? Number 2. Emperor Domitian. Rome in the 80s and 90s AD never really got a break from dying. The Antonine Plague had been cycling through the empire for decades by then, returning in waves that hit some provinces harder than others, but never fully disappeared. In the city itself, the pattern was grimly familiar. Fever, skin eruptions, lungs filling with fluid, people going from healthy to dead in a matter of days, with nothing in between. Whole city blocks would go quiet. Markets thinned out. The public baths, which were normally the loudest places in Rome, started feeling like somewhere you didn't want to linger. Nobody had a number for how many were dying because nobody had a reliable way to count. But Galen, who was still practicing medicine through this period, made clear in his writing that the death toll across the empire during these decades ran into the millions. For ordinary Romans, it had become background noise, terrible, constant, and completely outside anyone's control. Domitian had been emperor since 81 AD, and he was not a man who inspired much affection. He was intelligent, detail-obsessed, and deeply paranoid about anyone he thought might be building influence or loyalty that didn't run directly through him. The Stoic philosophers particularly bothered him. Senators and intellectuals whose entire worldview was built around the idea that virtue and reason matter more than power, which was exactly the kind of thinking that makes emperors nervous. They had audiences. They had students. They had the kind of quiet influence that doesn't show up on a list, but shapes how people think about who deserves to rule and why. Domitian watched them the way you watch something you've already decided to remove, just waiting for the right moment. The plague gave him his moment. During the years of peak mortality, when mass burial was standard and individual deaths required no formal accounting, Domitian accelerated his campaign against the Stoic opposition with a speed that would have been impossible under normal conditions. Senators were arrested. Intellectuals were executed. The bodies disappeared into the same mass counts that were absorbing thousands of plague victims every month. No investigation, no public record, no one asking questions because everyone was too busy dealing with their own losses to notice a few extra names missing from the Senate. In 93 AD, he expelled all philosophers from Rome entirely, framing it as a moral cleanup, removing the corrupting influence of people who had clearly brought divine displeasure down upon the city. Domitian was assassinated in 96 AD, stabbed in his bedroom by members of his own household staff. The Senate, which had lived in fear of him for 15 years, declared him a public enemy the same day and had his name chiseled off every monument in Rome. They had a word for it, damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, the official erasure of a person from history. Given everything he did while the plague was covering his tracks, is it justice that we remember him at all? Or is being remembered, even as a villain, exactly what someone like Domitian would have wanted? Number 1. Wang Mang. In the 1st century AD, China was drowning. The Yellow River, the longest, most unpredictable river in the ancient world, shifted course. Not gradually, it moved. Entire regions that had been farmland for generations disappeared underwater almost overnight. What the floods didn't destroy, the famine did. Crops failed across huge stretches of the country. Villages emptied. People who had farmed the same land as their grandparents found themselves with nothing. No harvest, no home, no way to feed their children. And then, on top of the floods and the famine, disease moved in. Epidemics spread through populations that were already starving and displaced, people whose bodies had nothing left to fight with. The peasant provinces of the Qin dynasty were not just struggling, they were collapsing, region by region, in a cascade that nobody at the center of power seemed capable of stopping or even slowing down. Wang Mang was that center of power. He had taken the throne in 9 AD through a combination of political maneuvering and a surprisingly convincing argument that the Han dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven and that he was the legitimate replacement. He presented himself as a Confucian reformer, a man of learning and principle who would restore the classical order. For a brief period, some people actually believed him. Then the Yellow River moved and everything fell apart. And what Wang Mang did next removed any remaining doubt about what kind of ruler he actually was. Instead of sending grain, instead of organizing relief, instead of doing anything that might slow the dying, Wang Mang declared the infected and starving regions cursed by heaven. The people flooding out of those provinces looking for food and survival were not refugees in his official framing. They were demons, criminals, rebels against the divine order. He sent military expeditions into the disaster zones, with instructions not to help, but to suppress. Epidemic zones became free fire territories, where soldiers moved through populations that disease had already devastated. The dying were treated as the enemy. The logic was straightforward and brutal. By the time someone was desperate enough to join a peasant uprising, they were already too sick and hungry to be useful to anyone. Better to classify them as a threat and eliminate them than to spend resources keeping them alive. It didn't work. The rebellions kept coming, kept growing, fed by the same hunger and desperation that Wang Mang kept trying to exterminate instead of address. In 23 AD, rebel forces reached him. He was killed, and his head was paraded through the provinces he had tried to cleanse. The peasants he sent the army to destroy were the ones who ended his dynasty. So here's the question. At what point does a ruler stop being someone who failed to help their people and become someone who was never trying to in the first place? 8 rulers, 8 plagues, 8 different methods, but the same pattern every single time. When the world starts falling apart, somewhere at the top, there is always someone taking notes, making lists, and waiting for the right moment to act. Maybe the plague was never the real catastrophe. Maybe it just showed us who was already there.